The mood between Russia and Germany is arguably more tense than it has been in a long time. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, relations have been on ice, and one group in particular has been caught between two fronts. The talk is of the Russian Germans. They are the result of a centuries-long wave of immigration of Germans to Russia. Several million of them returned to Germany after World War II, but hundreds of thousands still live in Russia today. But how did this strong immigration to Russia come about, and what was their life like there, and why did so many return to Germany after all? We'll look at all these questions in today's video. Enjoy! The first Germans reached the territories of the later Russia already around the year 1200. It was mainly Lübeck merchants who established trading houses in Novgorod in the name of the Hanseatic League. A few centuries later, German pioneer soldiers helped the Russian Grand Duke Ivan the Terrible to conquer large territories of the Tatars on the Volga, opening the way for Russia to Siberia. As a thanks, Germans were very much welcomed in Moscow, and an immigration of German professionals was encouraged. It was not until the 17th century that some Tsars implemented a course of Russification, so all foreigners were quartered behind the city limits of Moscow in a separate neighborhood. Although Germans made up only a small part of all foreigners in Moscow, this quarter was called the German suburb or New Germans. At the time, Russians referred to all German Europeans who did not speak Russian as Nemci or Germans. However, the majority of Germans settled in Russia in the 18th century at the time of Catherine the Great. The Tsar's family turned more and more to Europe, and there was a mixture with other European noble families. And so it also happened with Catherine the Great. A German-born woman came to the Russian throne. And this one promoted like no other the immigration of the citizens from her homeland to Russia. The main goal was to populate the extremely sparsely populated areas around the major Russian cities in order to protect them from raids. And the repatriates were also lured with great privileges. Among other things, they were offered 30 years of tax exemption, exemption from military service, freedom of religion, and German was tolerated as the language of local government. And this offer seemed to many Germans to be the best way out of their modest lives in war-ravaged Central Europe. In the first few years, more than 30,000 Germans, especially from the Rhine region, northern Bavaria and Hesse, set out to the long journey to Russia. Thousands lost their lives on the arduous journey alone. And upon arrival, it became clear to many that the promised paradise did not await them here after all. They were not allowed to settle in the cities and were shipped off to far-flung rural areas in the Volga region. Craftsmen were not allowed to continue practicing their professions, but had to work as peasants. But even for the skilled peasants, this turned out to be very difficult, since the soil and land conditions were completely different from those in their homeland. Thus, many Germans did not survive the hardships and the cold winters, and in the first years, thousands more of the Aussiedlers lost their lives. But with the time, the new inhabitants got used to the harsh conditions, and by the end of the 18th century, many Germans managed to live a moderate life in Russia. And after the first repatriates had laid a foundation, eventually more and more Germans were drawn to faraway places in search of a new life. Thus, the number of Germans grew to 60,000 by 1815, and by 1850 there were already 165,000. In the meantime, they were also allowed to settle in other places, so that German repatriate colonies were established in many parts of Russia. Towns such as Joseftal, Halbstadt and Schönfeld were established. And in the large Russian cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, Germans were usually the largest population group after the Russians. However, at the end of the 19th century, the Russian leadership changed its course and began the so-called Russification of the immigrants. Moreover, the privileges granted to them by Catherine the Great were also taken away. And from then on, the situation became more and more difficult. Especially with the First World War and later under Stalin, a strong anti-German sentiment broke out. Many were expropriated, deported or directly killed. During World War II, Stalin had made many Russian Germans deported to Kazakhstan or Siberia to prevent collaboration with the Germans. Many did not survive this chapter. And because of this negative experience, there were waves of immigration back to Germany in the decades after the war. However, a large part of the Germans were allowed to immigrate only with the policy of perestroika in the 1980s. From 1987 to the present day, there were about 2.4 million people. These are called Spätaussiedler. Nevertheless, some remained in Russia. In the last Russian census, the Germans were still shown as having a population of 400,000, which still makes them a substantial minority.